Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are tuning in from. Welcome to today's session, part of Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis webinar series. I'm Lizzi C, a fellow on the Chinese economy at CCA, and I'm really excited to have you with us for what's sure to be an insightful conversation. If you're new to the series, we've been diving deep into China's post-Third Plenum strategies. Today, we're zooming in on the tech sector, what's driving China's relentless push in certain sectors, the obstacles they're running into, and what's next, particularly with US export controls in the mix. Before we jump in, let me introduce our stellar lineup of panelists. We have Mary Hui, a journalist at Bloomberg and a researcher with a focus on industrial policies. We have Paul Triolo, partner at ASG and one of the top experts in China tech policy. We have Glenn Luck, CFO of Catalyte and co-founder of healthcare.com. Finally, we have Kevin Xu, founder of the Interconnected newsletter, investor and startup advisor. So let's kick things off. Paul, I will start with you. China's Big Fund 3.0 is your latest attempt to supercharge the semiconductor industry. We've seen them hit some bumps in the past, right? Fraud, mismanagement, misuse of resources, you name it. So what has changed with Big Fund 3.0 this time around? How are they tackling those issues? And do you think is this a moment where they finally make breakthroughs and compete with global heavyweights?
Thanks, Lizzie, and great to be a part of this all-star panel here. I'm very honored to be on with Kevin and Glenn and Mary in particular. This is a complicated issue, so I think maybe it's worth a quick step back because the fund, I think, is the National IC Investment Fund, has been around for a decade now. And so I think the better way to think about it is how does the new fund fit into the overall strategy? So I did a paper for the American Affairs Journal in February where I called the new approach that China is taking and Chinese industry is taking, semiconductor industrial policy 3.0. And so if we look back, initially there was a government-led effort to drive the semiconductor industry. But again, the semiconductor industry is a global industry, and it's really tricky for governments to be in the driver's seat. So in 2014, of course, the National IC Investment was set up in part to use more market-oriented forces. But that's proven to be a challenge. As you noted, there's a lot of corruption. There was not a lot of success, arguably, although there are certainly a few successes. The first and second tranches of the IC Investment Fund, there was an effort to acquire foreign companies, for example, in the U.S., which spooked a lot of American government officials and led to some pushback on China for trying to acquire U.S. companies. So now we're sort of in this a new era that's also characterized by export controls, and so China is now reacting to a much more complicated external environment. And so this semiconductor industry policy 3.0 that I call it has a number of really key elements. The first is trying to have a bigger role for a major company like Huawei in the mix here, and also at the top a little bit more nuanced top-down approach. A leading small group, for example, on semiconductors that's trying to look at new ways to help drive the industry, given that it's facing so much outside pressure. The other big issue is public-private partnerships, and so there's been an effort to open up government R&D, for example, to leading companies like Huawei and SMIC, the leading domestic foundry, and YMTC, and some of the tool makers like Naura and AMEC. And then there's also the high-tech stock markets in Shanghai and Beijing, for startups. And so this is a real overall a very comprehensive and new approach, I think, that's being taken here. And within that context, the fund is still important, but arguably maybe less important than it was originally. It will certainly provide a lot of funding. There's no lack of funding in China for semiconductor industry companies and initiatives. But the real hard part is that, the bottlenecks that China has to overcome and Chinese companies have to overcome because of the export controls are really tough. And those are longer term endeavors, and also the investors here is tricky, right? Investors that if you're going to invest in this industry from the private sector, for example, you need long-term investors, patient investors who are not going to necessarily get big returns in the short term. And so I think there's still some sort of struggling within the Chinese government, for example, how to best position the Chinese government and the fund to help with this process, because fundamentally this is a market-driven industry and a technology-driven industry, and you can't really plan, your way to success here. So some of the bottlenecks like EUV lithography, for example, those are really tough, engineering and sort of scientific endeavors that certainly are happening now in China, and we can talk about more how successful those will be. But those are very complicated issues, and so China is also trying to plug gaps across the supply chain. So it's not just tools; it's materials, advanced materials, and substrates, and process gases, et cetera, et cetera. So no country has ever tried to go it alone, arguably, and China doesn't really want to go it alone too. And Chinese companies, they want to still be part of the global semiconductor supply chain and division of labor. But it's a big complicated stew here. And the investment fund, I think, is important and will play a big role. As it's been reconstituted, after the big fraud and corruption investigation that landed most of its senior executives, somewhere in jail or in detention. And so it's definitely important, but I think it has to be seen in the context of the broader industrial policy that's playing out in China in the semiconductor space.
Thank you so much, Paul. And Glenn, building on what Paul just said about investment, we've seen, especially in the news, that traditional venture capital seems to be drying up in China. And now this model of state-led venture capital is stepping in to fill the gaps for these massive industrial projects. Given your knowledge of China's investment landscape, how do you see this shift in financial structure affecting innovation? Is state capital really up to the task, or are we just opening doors to new issues and new challenges, Glenn?
Yeah, thank you. And like Paul, I'm also very excited to be here with this impressive panel of guests to talk about technology, state-led venture capital, advanced manufacturing, and industrial policy in China. My background's been in investing, and as part of this job, I think we need to think about the big picture or the macro, but also dive into the details or the micro. And so, at the macro level, this is kind of my approach. It's important to form mental models for how the world works. And this includes, I think, views on how the political economy works as well. Whereas at the micro level, I think this involves diving into the details. And so it's just a lot of collecting and analyzing data at the company level. And it all eventually comes together because we have to continuously refine the mental model at a high level, but it's also based on data that we collect at the ground level. And that model, the model itself provides direction on where to go out and look for new data to analyze. So on this very specific question of, I think, state-led venture capital, I think it's very dependent, Lizzie, on sector by sector. And there's a general different approach depending on the sector. Paul talked about semiconductors, which is a much more global industry. I've been spending a lot of my time researching and focusing in on infrastructure and technology that are related to the really what I think is one of the key priorities for Chinese policymakers, which is the push for energy independence. And so I think what we've seen with these industries, which are much more highly capital intensive, and often what we mean by capital intensity in infrastructure means labor, is that one, it's dominated by state companies. So if we look at power generation, to the grid companies, to the rail networks, these are all the end buyers or the end operators are all state companies, and it requires significant coordination of both capital as well as labor resources, which are all deeply, deeply connected to the state and therefore connected to industrial policy. So I'm going to talk about, I think, specifically about the electric vehicle and the battery industry later. But I think on the sort of state-led venture capital topic, keep in mind about China is just that scale and industry verticalization at the industry level are really the two main concepts to keep in mind. The general approach for, especially for new industries, is from a policymaker perspective, is the ability to scale affordably. So in order to do that, because China is so big, it just needs to produce much of the value chain of these new industries domestically, especially during that nascent ramp-up stage. I think Chinese policymakers are ultra aware that the scale of China provides a very large advantage at the industry level. And so, I spent a lot of time, for example, with high-speed rail. Today, China accounts for 80% of the world's high-speed rail network, and the entire industry was really developed domestically. And actually, contrary to popular belief, the critical success factor, somewhat ironically, was not actually technology, but it was actually civil engineering of the tens of thousands of miles of viaducts and tunnels and bridges. And so if we think about the scale of that industry today and look back 15 years ago, nobody could have really done this for China. It had to do it itself. So today it takes, I think, the same approach to new industries like solar, like new energy infrastructure, like electric vehicles. It looks at the end product or goal, and then it works its way up the supply chain to the very, very top. And the policymakers in Beijing formulate industry strategy and guidelines. Now, when it goes through this process, some parts of the value chain are quite clearly going to involve or be run by state entities. For example, in the solar industry, power is a state monopoly. So the ultimate buyers of the majority of the market for grid solar panels are going to be national level SOEs. And so if you think about that, traditional venture capital, which is the industry that I was a part of in a previous life, it's just not going to work that well here. So number one, venture capital demands much higher financial returns, and these are often public good sectors where there are significant social externalities to take into account, which is why in a lot of these cases, SOEs play a major role. And then two, the state really needs to play a critical role in assembling the financing aspect. Remember, these are very capital-intensive industries, and also coordinating that flow of human capital and labor, like migrant workers, to go out and put up these solar farms and wind panels. And so venture capital has just historically not been a great asset class for labor-intensive businesses and infrastructure. But when we get to other parts of the value chain, it's not always as clear. So especially for industries where that involve consumers and households making decisions like electric vehicles, I don't think Chinese policymakers or Beijing is necessarily wedded to or biased to one form of ownership over the other in some of these cases. I think in a lot of cases, they're just not sure, and they'll often encourage both forms of ownership to kind of duke it out in competition. We're seeing that right now with electric vehicles, where private sector players and SOEs are competing very intensely on trying to see which approach and which form of ownership and which set of differentiating competencies will ultimately win. And so this is where I think we've seen traditional venture capital play a more significant role.
Thank you so much. Right, Glenn, thank you so much. And I think you made a extremely important point that, China's tech push is not just about one big innovation. It's part of a much broader policy agenda that has social component, that has sort of human capital component. We're going to zoom out at the very end of the webinar. We're going to invite you back to connect the dots for us. But for now, I wanted to go back to Paul and talk about sort of the organizational structure a little bit more. Paul, as you alluded to earlier on, Ding Xuexiang's, sort of working group seems to be calling the shots on China's industrial policy here. So tell us a little more. Are we seeing examples of how the group actually works? Is Ding Xuexiang the person who's currently taking the reign on China's industrial policy? And how has this new balance between SOE as the coordinator and private sector as the innovator, so to speak, work within this new approach? Are we just reshuffling the deck, or is there anything new here, Paul?
Well, I think there's a lot new here. So it's really tough to get a read on, at the top how industrial policy is being made here in this particular sector. It's a very sensitive topic now, and so it's sort of reading the tea leaves here and trying to understand, how decisions are made. Certainly, there is evidence that the NDRC and whatever sort of top level group is looking at the semiconductor industry is looking broadly across the sector and probably weighing in on mergers and acquisitions, for example, with foreign companies. There have been a number in the semiconductor industry over the last year, including Intel having one shot down by not approved by the Chinese antitrust authorities. So I think that's a process that's going on. The difference is, though, that instead of an SOE, I think you said SOE here. I think my sense is the decision has been made to let a company like Huawei, with all of its advantages, its high silicon chip design arm, for example, which was doing world-class design before Huawei was added to the NE list in 2019 and 2020, to put them in charge of at some level. How much authority is tricky to say, but at least have them have some oversight from a private sector company like Huawei of the entire industry supply chain, to help figure out how to drive forward and overcome some of those key bottlenecks. So, for example, in the advanced lithography, so-called extreme ultraviolet lithography area, where of course China has been unable to get those systems from Dutch leader ASML since probably 2018 or 2019. That's a big area where there's a lot of R&D, where the government may have R&D, for example, that's relevant. Huawei, you see little tidbits. Huawei had released, there was a patent related to EUV that Huawei was pursuing. And also just this week, we saw SMEE, the domestic leader in lithography, a patent was released that was from 2023. And so clearly there's a lot of R&D and efforts going on in this very complicated space. And so having some, really technically capable company oversee this or drive this, I think is where we are now, which is very different than having an SOE. In other sectors, you have had, in aviation and aerospace, you've had, real SOEs, longstanding SOEs sort of drive the train or be in a position to oversee the sector. Whereas here it's complicated, right? Because it is a global sector. It's still market driven, very technology intensive, capital intensive. And so you do need a player, arguably like Huawei, which has been successful in other areas, obviously things like telecommunications equipment and handsets, but also because of their high silicon arm in particular, 15,000 or so engineers who were very savvy and working at the cutting edge of chip design. You at least have some ability to help to see Huawei as a key player in driving the industry. They're building a big new campus in Shanghai, and so I would assume that there's some of that is going to be R&D on the tool side, bringing together the tool makers. Because this is not just about one thing, lithography. It's about a whole bunch of different tools. It's about a whole bunch of different materials, as I mentioned earlier, and things like arcane things like photoresists. So again, the challenge here is that and trying to move to that to sort of develop a new indigenous supply chain for some of these technologies. There's many different pieces that have to come together. But I think that the new thing is the fund probably being pushed by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And then Huawei, I think, has the full backing of the National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC. And so it's sort of a two-pronged approach, which is, okay, we have a lot of funding coming from the fund. We can direct it into areas that are important. And then you have Huawei being sort of given some free rein in terms of how it's driving things. So, for example, Huawei probably has its own production line, sort of pilot production line that's using domestic tooling, and eventually would probably be an area to test something as advanced as an EUV system. It's really hard to tell where things are in that space, though, because again, it's there's a lot of desire on the part of those companies to keep under wraps, the progress they're making and not draw attention to that. So the part of the challenge in assessing where China is and Chinese companies are on these areas is that it's tough to get really good data. I'm doing an update on the paper I did in February for the American Affairs Journal to try to capture some of this dynamic and explain, sort of where things are going here. But in any case, in the short term, China still has a lot of DUV equipment that it's going to be using despite export controls, and we can certainly talk about that. But they're pushing those machines to their limits, and can probably get down to something like 5 nanometers. And so they have some time, in other words, to sort of keep the intense R&D going on these other technologies to help eventually be able to move to some more advanced nodes. But there's a lot of leeway and runway there, using the existing technology.
Well, thank you so much. And speaking of Huawei, Kevin, I'm going to bring you in here. Let's address the elephant in the room now, U.S. export controls. As you know, these restrictions have thrown major wrench into China's tech plans, especially for companies like Huawei and SMIC. So Kevin, how are these firms adapting based on your observations? Some of them are on-the-ground observations. And are we seeing real innovation to bypass those barriers, or is it just like a matter of cobbling together temporary fixes? Give us your assessment of the situation here.
So Paul and I have talked a lot about this topic in various venues, so I won't repeat a lot of what he has said already on this topic, which is very much on point. I would just want to maybe characterize this for people who don't follow this very closely, like everybody on this panel does, kind of the push and pull dynamic of this export control, which has come in 2 rounds, right, ever since October 2022. And the push side is very rational, right? As soon as you have export control, even the first round being implemented or being announced, you're just going to have a lot of Chinese companies stockpiling all the restricted equipments and the restricted technology and software, from electronic design automation to the lithography equipments that Paul was talking about, just to get them really quick first and decide what to do with them later, because that's not going to be available to you for a very long time. And you see this in the earnings report of all these companies. Most of them are either American or European, have a huge jump in orders from PRC entities right off the bat. That is just a very natural response to any sort of export control, right? And after the second round of export control, which is October 2023, and this one was very much motivated by the emergence of generative AI and all the GPUs, the other kinds of hardware, the processors that you need to really build large language models and the future of AI frontier. You see a huge stockpiling activity again of restricted advanced chips, particularly from NVIDIA, whether it's A100s, H100s, and what have you. Those are the obvious things, right? And I would maybe talk more about the unintended consequences or the pull or some of these other aspects that the policymakers may or may not have anticipated. First is this huge injection, actually, of market dynamic within the Chinese market, which I would argue would not have happened without export control, right? You have this massive inelastic demand for this product already inside the Chinese market, with or without competition with the US markets or others. But now you have essentially one game in town, which is Huawei, and you have another one game in town, which is SMIC, to make the product for Huawei. And there is this bit of an unspoken consolidation even underneath the Huawei high silicon design sort of power. There's been a lot of competition before export control among all the big private Chinese tech players, from Alibaba to Baidu to Tencent. They're all making their own chips. At least some of these divisions have become kind of all of a sudden less visible and just started buying Huawei chips, right? I think the most notable one is probably Alibaba's T-Head division, which has been very highly prominent for some time, but is a lot less visible. Baidu is still trying to make their own chip, but they're also buying a lot of Huawei product. This is the Ascend series, which is competitive in some way to the GPUs that NVIDIA is pushing out, but certainly still, I would say, 2 to 3 generations behind. And just very recently, you see see ByteDance pushing really hard for their own custom designed GPUs to push forward their own AI ambition, working with Broadcom, for example, which is the major kind of ASIC design player, and working with TSMC to manufacture their custom chips, which is throwing an interesting wrinkle, I'd say, to the ongoing expanding of the yard when it comes to US export control. And another interesting, again, market dynamic, right? There's nothing to do with the big funds that Paul was talking about at this point. This is just Huawei getting a bunch of purchase orders and then working with SMIC to make these chips. SMIC is getting a bit of a boost as well before it has to probably compete with TSMC and Samsung for these orders. Now it is working with Huawei and other domestic designers as well to really push their capability forward, which I would argue, again, a top-down directive will never get them this far, but a market dynamic with real design, real problems, real yield requirement, real unit economics requirement would. And we see that a little bit already last year with the introduction of Huawei's new with the previously new smartphone, the Mate 60 with the 7 nanometer production. All commentary suggests that even with their existing pile of DUV equipments that they have legally purchased from ASML, they can probably utilize different levels of multi-patterning to push forward into 5 nanometer, even into 3 nanometer, which is what the new ASML CEO has suggested. That being said, I think there's still a huge barrier for them to be able to scale up this capability, for them again to be, unit economics salient, if you will, or have good yield, for that to be a good product to serve again just the insatiable market of demand in China. This is really China for China itself. There's really no other country or no other business that is involved in this, I would say, quite cut off ecosystem. So if you're a proponent of decoupling, I say this is actually working quite well if you think that's happening.
Thank you so much. So, Mary, I'm going to bring you on and switch gears a little bit. So we've been talking about, EUV lithography, 3D NAND technology, those major tech hurdles China's facing, especially when it comes to achieving sub 7 nanometer process nodes. But as you point out in your recent case study you incorporate your newsletter, not every bottleneck needs a industrial policy solution, basically. Can you walk us through the ballpoint pen example you study in your newsletter and sort of how it ties into this broader conversation about China's tech strategy? What's actually required, what's not required?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Lizzie. I guess I'll start by saying, Glenn, I really like the way you framed the macro, micro levels of analysis and how the two of them kind of have a lot of interactions with each other. And you really need both to build out a comprehensive understanding of Chinese industrial policy and industrial landscape. And I guess in my research, of Chinese industrial strategies based on open source documents and various kind of academic research done in China, I mostly veer towards the macro, but only because I don't have enough of the expertise to dive into the really micro details. I'm really glad that we have Kevin and Paul and you, Glenn, also on this call to kind of provide a lot of the nitty-gritty details. But yes, so back to the ballpoint pens. I guess China started talking about specifically like chokehold technologies kind of quite prominently, maybe around definitely by 2015, by the time the Made in China plan was rolled out with the 10 kind of focus areas of technology highlighted, and then followed by 2018 with a publication of I think it was 35 technologies, right, in the Science and Technology Daily, the state media. So what are chokehold technologies? Like cardboards? It's quite a visual a representation of the idea of being stuck, caught because of one particular pain point in the supply chain. And but there are like various reasons why you would get stuck there, right? One, it's maybe you can't access the technology. The other is that you can't make it if you can't access it domestically. And then 3, it's, well, even if you can make it, does your market want to use it? So the ballpoint pen analogy, or the case study rather, illustrates this quite well in that China for a long while had been producing a lot of ballpoint pens for much of the global market. I think it had the vast majority of the global market by export volume, but it still was heavily dependent on imports of the particular ballpoint pen tip that is required to then allow ink to roll onto the piece of paper. And this was raised at the national level. Eventually, it reached senior level politicians, leaders, who then decide, okay, this is a choke point. We need to deal with this. How is it that China can build submarines and aircraft and high-speed rail and the like, but not make a ballpoint pen tip? This does not seem to make sense. And so in goes industrial policy inputs, and it was decided that there would be a state-led effort to direct millions of dollars to producing this very particular input, the steel ballpoints. Eventually, after some years, this was achieved to great fanfare, celebrated in state media as a choke point being broken, a choke hold being broken, choke point being sanded off. But ultimately, China right now is still actually dependent on the very same inputs that this particular industrial policy was meant to address, because it just didn't fit with the market dynamics. Just to use the same phrase that Kevin was earlier referring to, that maybe industrial policy really doesn't have that much say or influence over whether users, firm level the decision makers, and various other stakeholders, whether particular purchasing decisions or various other economic calculus make sense for them. So, in this particular case, maybe, the industrial policy really didn't need to be directed towards ballpoint pens, and resources could have been better allocated to figuring something else out.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. And Glenn, I'm going to bring you back in and get to the numbers a little bit. Speaking of China's industrial policy, we heard controversies surrounding profitability, right? Nobody is earning any money. There's this, evolutionary price war going on. There's overcapacity, et cetera, et cetera. You've actually been tracking profitability and margins in emerging sectors supported by Beijing. So how are the financial dynamics actually shaking out? And also this idea that China is over investing, but your take is that it's not just about bad financial planning. It's actually more about embedding other programs, say social programs, into those larger projects. Can you please break that logic down for us, Glenn?
Yeah, sure. And just to sort of touch on, I think it's actually very interesting that this panel is supposed to be about advanced technology, but actually we're talking a lot about ballpoint pens and rail, which are old technologies. But just from an industrial policy perspective, I think what the parallels there are that the Chinese government's been actually doing this for a long time. It was doing it on industries that weren't considered advanced tech. And now that we're getting into advanced tech, I think it's just applying a lot of the same principles with flexibility, learning from the past, into these industries. And so I think electric vehicles are now in vogue. It's one of the strategic industries. And recently I've been, per your introduction, spending time getting up to speed. I was just, over the last year, inundated by a raft of names and brands and companies that I've never heard of before. And over the past few months, I've been trying to get my handle around that. And for me, coming from the investment side, I think for me, getting a handle around things is actually about delving into the financials and understanding through the financials, industry dynamics, and where value is being created. So I'm just going to really start off with just a very, very quick financial analysis primer by looking at like a typical car company and just going through 4 key items. One is revenue. So this is just selling your car. 2 is, when you sell your car, you have materials, you have a factory, you have direct labor, you have a few other things that goes into what they call cost of revenue or cost of goods sold. And that provides a margin. Hopefully you're making some margin on all the inputs that are going in. I think 20% right now is pretty good in the electric vehicle industry. And then after that, you have operating costs, which are fixed in a sense. A lot of human capital, white collar labor. You've got general administrative, which is your corporate office, strategy, finance. You've got sales and distribution, which is your retail outlets, the sales commissions you pay to sales agents, advertising. And then the critical one is research and development for a product like electric vehicles. These are engineers that design the cars and all the components that go into the cars and put it all together. And you bottle all that up, and you ultimately end up with operating income, which is the profit. And so I think what's interesting is that while all companies follow this general format, I think every industry is actually a little bit different, and we have to kind of separate the two from an industry perspective, and then we look in from a sort of internal industry competitive perspective. And in the case of electric vehicles, there's a lot of relevance with batteries. So you actually have two of the three new industries that are highly, highly connected. So the first thing I would say about EVs and batteries and solar is that there's this concept of commodity versus non-commoditized industries that I think people need to understand, and how that drives industry dynamics and profitability. Solar and battery are commodity industries. By commodity industry, I mean you can boil down performance down to almost like one metric. I think for solar, it's dollars per watt. And for batteries, it's dollars per kilowatt hour. And, you can make a better, design a better battery pack. There can be some safety features, but ultimately what it comes down to for the end purchaser, which is typically an electric vehicle car company, it's dollars per kilowatt hour. That's really what it comes down to. So for these companies, this commodity nature of the product drives effectively what becomes a very, very cyclical industry. And the driver of the cyclicality is that these are also highly capital intensive industries where you have to install a bunch of specialized equipment plus off-the-shelf equipment in sort of successive generations. And the act of doing that actually drives down the unit economics of the commodity unit economics, whether it's dollars per watt or dollars per kilowatt hour. And that's how you succeed, and that's how you win. So in the battery and in the solar industry, what people have been talking about, when people talk about overcapacity or the sort of unbearable pressure or the nadir, the involution, it's actually driven by this cyclical cycle of capex-driven cyclicality. But electric vehicles are actually very, very different. Cars are not commodity products. Cars are products that are made for certain consumer segments at different levels. You have affluent consumers, you have budget consumers, you have middle-class consumers. They cater to your sort of identity. Women like a certain brand of cars, men like a different brand of cars, athletes like some cars, young families like other cars. So it's actually a very non-commoditized product. And so it's driven actually by a different dynamic, which right now in China is that there are a lot of people trying to cater to every single segment of the market, and they're coming out with hundreds of models, and there's dozens of car companies that have multiple design teams coming out with all these models, and they're all competing with each other. So whereas in the commodity industries, a lot of the specialization and differentiation is actually in that cost of revenue, that cost of goods line, which drives the gross margin. In the electric vehicle industry, what drives profitability and what drives that nadir is actually in the research and development line item and in the engineering staff. And so recently, I've to get a handle on the entire industry, I've actually gone through about 20 publicly listed car companies, both EV companies as well as the traditional ICE companies that are incumbents in the industry that also have significant EV operations. And I've gotten a handle on their financials and their profitability at the company level, and I boiled it up at the industry level. And then I did it for batteries, and batteries was a lot easier because there is really one player that you need to pay attention to, and that's CATL. And so I just had to look at their financials for CATL. And when I did this, it became very, very clear that the profitability issues that some people attribute to overcapacity, which I don't think it's overcapacity, but the profitability issues are very, very clear. It's that you have BYD, which is a battery maker, as we all know, and CATL taking about 2/3 of industry gross margin and over 100% of the operating profit of the industry. So they are actually the ones. I think what's interesting is that the pressure, the nature, is actually caused by BYD and CATL being so dominant in the industry, and that sort of speaks to the sort of industry and competitive dynamics and how actually competition within the industry actually matters. I talked about scale and verticalization, industry verticalization at the industry level, and that's where the policymakers really focus. But at the company level, I think scale and verticalization are also quite important. You have a company like BYD, which is, and one reason for its success is because it has intensively vertically integrated. It's not only got the batteries, but they're designing their own chips. They're even going upstream and sourcing materials. That is just in their nature. Whereas other EV companies are trying hard to differentiate themselves in different ways. NIO is trying to leverage this unique battery swapping technology in its cars, and they're also focusing on the high end. The state-owned enterprises are focused on their cash flowing ICE businesses and converting them through manufacturing excellence to flexible manufacturing of EVs, as well as looking at export markets. And other companies like Xiaopeng are focused on software and ADAS. So all the companies are competing with each other on very different levels. And this is emblematic of a product that's actually non-commoditized, so that you have very disparate forms of differentiation. So that was what was really interesting to me, is that what the sort of industry profitability problems, you never hear about BYD or CATL kind of complaining about it because they're the ones who are winning. It's actually the smaller players that are struggling with profitability, and it's in large part because the leaders are purposely driving that. They're lowering costs, they're driving costs down, they're adding features and functionality, and they're leveraging their scale. And if I'm actually sitting in Beijing, part of me is thinking, like, of knocking on the door of BYD and saying, hey, and CATL and saying, hey, let up a little bit, like let the other competitors actually make some more money and get to a healthier industry environment. So anyway, long story short, I think the sort of industry profitability question is a much more complicated one. It requires going in at a bottoms up level and actually seeing these dynamics play out. And these dynamics, by the way, are going to change. I'll just end with one other factor, which is the smaller players aren't standing still. The smaller EV companies recognize that the battery makers are squeezing out all the margin in the system, but I think they're going to fight back. They're going to say, hey, I can be a battery maker myself. So you have Geely, for example, recently opening up a 24 gigawatt hour plant with its parent company, and it's starting to make its own batteries. As a lot of people know, Tesla is also vertically integrating into the battery cell at the very top level of the battery cell and the chemistry level, so that it too can no longer be squeezed by the battery companies. And this is going to be a very natural and evolving dynamic within the industry, where over time the differentiating factors, maybe batteries don't become as important when everybody has scale. Maybe we start to look at some of the interesting stuff that the pure play NEV companies like NIO are doing, and that becomes more of a differentiator. But I think the way that we have to look at this is as a dynamic, evolving industry, as a non-commoditized industry that's driven by very different dynamics as an industry like solar or a commoditized cyclical industry like batteries.
Fantastic. Really great stuff, Glenn. And, thank you so much for crunching those numbers for us. But I also want to get to some of the fun stuff. What's next for China's tech scene? And Mary, I know you've been watching this idea of low altitude economy and humanoid robots. They are becoming a much bigger focus now. Can you please help us understand how China is building sort of next gen technology in those space, and talk about the key regulatory or infrastructure hurdles that might speed up or slow down their rollouts in the coming years? And how do these Chinese companies or Chinese players stack up against global competitors?
Yeah, the reason why I initially became interested in looking at the Chinese low altitude economy is because I'm often trying to find maybe gaps in discourse between how English language coverage media is discussing a particular technology or an industry and versus how Chinese language sources are doing it. And, in looking at that, whether certain areas of focus are different, whether particular questions are being asked in one place or the other, and what that can reveal about, one, analytical frameworks, and then two, what relative strengths and weaknesses, and also priorities that emanate from those differences. And it seemed like the low altitude economy was a really good way to try and answer some of these questions, because, say, in US press, a lot of attention has been paid to DJI and other major Chinese drone makers and the kind of perceived national security risks that they pose. And a lot of the attention has been paid to single point kind of surface level companies, right? Like DJI, as I've just mentioned. But we zoom out to kind of the Chinese discussion of it. It is much more about the entire ecosystem of drone makers, but also other kind of low altitude aircraft, and then more broadly how all of these technologies come together to create a low altitude economy that also requires a lot of infrastructural buildup. And as Glenn mentioned earlier, perhaps the kind of the critical factor to high-speed rail being so successful in China was less about the technology than about the infrastructure and the civil engineering that enabled it. And maybe we'll see a similar dynamic, I think, playing out with the low-altitude economy, in spite of the fact that much of the attention now is being paid to single drone makers. So I see the low-altitude economy as being kind of emblematic of maybe this kind of not a mismatch, but maybe kind of a gap, right, between the ways the technology is being thought about. So that's more of an overview. I guess maybe doesn't answer every aspect of your question, but I'm cognizant of the time, so maybe I'll leave it here for now.
Well, thank you so much, Mary, for giving us sort of that overview. And in future sessions of this webinar, we'll make sure to have further in-depth discussions on sort of what's the next frontier for China's tech scene. But before we end, Kevin, I want to pivot back to you. Given the timing of this webinar during this election season, there's been a lot of buzz about how China has been getting around those export controls. A lot of buzz about parallel markets for restricted techs like GPUs, workaround for US export controls. So how big of a problem is this? And can these loopholes be closed, or are we just playing whack-a-mole here, Kevin?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a topic that we could explore with a full webinar length on, but I'll be super quick with the next 2 minutes, which is that there has been a lot of very sexy headlines when it comes to black markets of GPUs, lots of very fun kind of spy novel type details of different people smuggling restricted NVIDIA GPUs through suitcases via Hong Kong or Singapore, or etching off their serial numbers and whatnot. And I would say two things. One, this is probably been happening for quite a bit of time, and when you have such a huge restriction in addition to such a high demand like we talk about, you're going to get a little smuggling going on. That's just kind of the natural response to these things, right? I would say it's a bit of a red herring in my opinion. Right now the rumored number is that there are about 100,000 H100s that are restricted, that has been smuggled into the People's Republic of China. Let's just take that at face value. That does sound like a lot of GPUs floating around in this big country. But if you kind of reduce that back to what is actually necessary to train frontier AI models, right? Meta, Microsoft, XAI, Elon Musk's AI outfit, and Oracle, and probably at least 2 other companies in the United States have at least one of these 100,000 cluster level GPU training setups for their own purpose, right? Versus, the entire country of the People's Republic of China having possibly this number of GPUs. And when it comes to engineering, you really have to tie up all these GPUs to work coherently together as essentially one GPU via either NVIDIA's CUDA software ecosystem or PyTorch, which is an open source equivalent of that, to really drive the kind of performance and efficiency that you need to train these models. So we're really evolving, I think, from a chip-to-chip level competition or a chip war into what I call a cloud war, which is large coherent systems of multiple hundreds of thousands of GPUs working together to be able to do these kind of AI innovations. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but I think the black market stuff is very fun to read, but a bit of a red herring when it comes to US-China competition and where things stand.
Thank you so
Let me
much
just
for
add
that
a
clarification.
quick
Yes, please.
addition to that. It was great comments by Kevin. I mean, there's a lot of reporting too about renting, companies that can rent GPUs in the cloud. And, this is an interesting sort of loophole that has not been closed, arguably. And maybe the U.S. Commerce Department may attempt to close this. But this is very common. And this goes from like small companies that are renting out hundreds of GPUs, for example, to the large hyperscalers like Google and Microsoft and others in the cloud, right? They're really big players, Amazon. And it's not clear to me that a Chinese company would choose to use one of those hyperscalers, for example, to train a major model in the cloud, or whether those cloud hyperscalers would agree to that, right? Given that there is a rule now in place for them to report, for example, any clients that are training major advanced models in the cloud. And so I think in the next 5 to 6 months, 3 to 6 months, we'll probably see an attempt to further close that loophole. And then I agree with Kevin that the smuggling is pretty small scale, given the sort of overall needs. So it's a complex mix right now of what's going on in China. And my sort of thesis, and I'm going to address this in the upcoming paper, is that national compute in China is going to become much more important. In other countries, the hyperscalers are arguing against national compute, but in China, you have some major projects like the East Data West Compute project and the National Unified Computing Network. And so I think that the whole project of having a major public sort of national compute effort will probably end up playing a pretty big role in China in some of these areas. And you will still have companies like ByteDance, as Kevin noted, trying to have develop its own chips, both for training and inference. But I think it's not clear to me that there can be multiple companies in China that are all trying to develop, 100,000 plus clusters of GPUs. It's just probably not going to be feasible, at least in the short term, unless Huawei and SMIC can, substantially ramp output of the Ascend series, which could happen. So anyway, great comments by Kevin, and I think I agree with all of them. And it's a complicated world of sort of what GPUs are available or not in China and where they're available physically or in the cloud.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much for your additional comment. This is such a fantastic discussion. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from semiconductor to robotics, energy, and ballpoint pen. I hope our audience has walked away with new insights into where China's industrial policy is headed, especially after the third Plenum. And to everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Please be sure to check out more of our content from this webinar series on Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis platform. Until next time, take care and have a great day.